Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I am your host, Attorney Henry Gornbein. Please watch us on YouTube and also like our show. Today on Gracefully Graying, I'm really pleased and honored to have as my guest Marilyn Kelly, who is currently the head of the Board of Governors at Wayne State University, but is a former Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court and has had a brilliant career and is really an example of someone who has lived her life fully. Marilyn, welcome.
Thank you, Henry. Good to be here.
First of all, tell us about your current position where you're now the head of the Wayne State University Board of Governors, and there's been a lot in the paper about it recently. So tell us about that.
There has. Well, as you know, the Board of Governors is the body that is responsible for picking the president of the university, Wayne State University, and for overseeing the administration of the university. It's a position that's elected by the people. So I was elected about 7 years ago. I've now served 6 years of an 8-year term, or nearly 6 years of an 8-year term. And I find it stimulating and very interesting. Wayne is my alma mater, is where I graduated from law school. And I feel a real commitment to that institution.
You know, I did my undergrad at Wayne. In fact, I went to Monteith College, which no longer exists. And then I went to U of M for law school. Wayne holds a special place in my heart. Tell us about some of the highs and lows of your career with the Michigan Supreme Court, where you served as Chief Justice for a time.
Well, let's see. It was a long period. I was on there for 2 full 8-year terms, 16 years. So obviously over a period of that length of time, there's a good bit of variation, and there was. We had a number of different justices coming and going during that period. In the beginning, when I first took office, it was a board that most of its members had been together for a number of years. They worked well together, and it was a pleasure to join them. It was nonpartisan in every way. For example, I very much enjoyed the company of people who had come from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in their background. And I found people eager to listen to one another and consider other people's points of view.
That's what it really is.
Certainly is. It's essential. Over the years, it did change, and the board became more conservative. And then in the early 2000s, I would say that we saw a period where a good bit of the precedent that had been established over the previous 50 years was swept away. And the board began to function in a more in a way which seemed to be more divided into blocks of interests. That for me was a low point, partly because I regretted seeing much of the precedent disappear. And also I regretted occasionally hearing complaints by lawyers who'd be in our courtroom saying that they felt they'd been treated rudely by justices on the court. Then in a later on, toward about 2009, the court changed somewhat in composition, and that's a period where I had the opportunity to be Chief Justice. And during the 2 years I was chief, I'd say those were clearly the high points for me during my years on the court.
Now in Michigan, once you reach 70, whether you're a Supreme Court justice or a district court judge, you can no longer run again. You can finish your term, but can't run. Do you have any opinion on term limits for judges as far as aging out?
Yeah, we have age limits, and many courts do across the country. It's pretty accepted, and it hasn't been overturned. The constitutionality of that kind of discrimination, if you will, has not ever been decided. it's certainly true that as we age, we sometimes can't handle the same level or quantity of work that we did when we were much younger. And to that degree, it certainly makes sense that there should be an age limit. On the other hand, it's obvious that not everybody who reaches 70 is similarly impaired, if impaired at all. So it is arbitrary and discriminatory to that degree. And the Judicial Selection Task Force, which I chaired along with Judge Ryan, recommended that Michigan do away with that constitutional provision and initiate a provision that would allow more flexibility to keep people in office past age 70 or past the years after their term expired when they reached age 70, so that they could still contribute on the bench.
Well, the federal system, judges can go into senior status and they can have a reduced caseload. And the prime example who just retired was federal Judge Avon Cohn, who was in his mid-90s and just retired, and he was still very, very sharp. Marilyn, you're also with the Institute of Continuing Legal Education at University of Michigan, and you're the editor of the newly published Michigan Family Law, the latest edition, which I'm pleased to be one of the authors of. And tell us about your work with ICLE.
Yes, well, it's been a joy. And by the way, Henry, it's a pleasure to have you as one of our contributing authors. Very fine work you've done. I remember editing the sections that you wrote just recently. It's a pleasure to work with the ICLE, and I'm much devoted to their work because I believe it's so important that we provide this means of keeping attorneys up to date on the law and providing them an easy and quick and meaningful explanation of the law as it evolves.
Yeah, it's constantly changing, and to me, the ICLE publications are like our Bibles, because if you need a quick reference or if you need to research something, it's there at your fingertips. And
that's right. That's right.
It's a wonderful tool. You were also once a teacher, if I remember, and also on the State Board of Education.
Right. Yes. And I'm a teacher again, having now left the court. I've gone to the law school at Wayne and I teach. And I very much enjoy it. I enjoy going back to teaching after having left it so many years ago. I never taught law before. Interestingly, I taught French when I was first out of graduate school, and began to pursue a degree in a PhD in French before I got into law.
You've had quite a career. What about, do you have any thoughts on the state of education here in Michigan?
I do. Obviously, I'm distressed to realize the extent to which over recent years the legislature has decreased the amount that it contributes to our school systems, particularly at the higher education level. At Wayne, for example, we've had to really scramble to try to make up the lost revenue from decreased appropriations by the Michigan legislature. And at the K through 12 level, it distresses me now, and it did when I was first elected to the State Board of Education in 1964. The same problem exists, where the inequality of funding of our public schools across the state.
It's a matter of money, and I guess a matter of, just priorities. And so it seems like the wrong priorities seem to be followed. But what can I say? You are a pioneer, because when I went to law school and I graduated in 1968, I think in my class at U of M there were 9 women, and you graduated, I think, a couple of years later.
Right.
What made you decide to become a lawyer?
It was as a direct result of my being elected to the State Board of Education. You'll recall that we had a brand new constitution in the 60s in the state of Michigan. And I learned when I took that office that new constitutional provisions are often challenged in the court. The provisions that had to do with the new State Board of Education were challenged. And I found myself working frequently and closely with the Attorney General and Assistant Attorney Generals on legal matters that arose out of the new Constitution. And the more I saw of the workings of the law and of state government, the more interested I became, and then became convinced I should change professions.
And I'm sure weren't you once with the front of the court as well?
No, I was not. I was never with the friend of the court.
Okay. But I know you've always had an affinity for family law because over the years you
right.
spoke.
And increasingly, as I practiced, practiced for 17 years before I took the bench. And in the latter years, I did a concentration of family law and greatly valued it and the challenges that it offers lawyers to serve their clients well.
And I know for the Institute of Continuing Legal Education annual forum, and you also spoke for the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers for many, many years. You give us updates on the latest appellate and Supreme Court decisions, and it was always a welcome treat for those of us who were in the tradition of family law.
Well, I appreciate you saying that.
Well, it's true. You're wonderful. What are some other highlights of your illustrious career that you'd like to share with our viewers?
For me, it was a real pleasure to be able to serve as Chief Justice because it gave me the opportunity to work on the administration of the courts. I, for example, was able to appoint the first Access to Justice coordinator, which was a role that was intended to help us focus on the justice gap. That is to say, the gap between those able to pay for legal assistance and those too impoverished to have their day in court. Another thing I was able to work on and I helped implement were guidelines for bettering the availability of trained interpreters for those who come into the courts with limited English proficiency. I was privileged to be able to work with the State Bar and the State Bar Foundation in the creation of Michigan Legal Help, which, as you probably know, is a website directed to people who have legal problems, are in a position where they must represent themselves in court and desperately need good legal information and resources, and also who need a way to find a good attorney to help them with their legal problems. Lastly, it comes to mind that I was particularly pleased with the opportunity to create the Judicial Selection Task Force, which was a bipartisan task force. I referred to it earlier that I co-chaired with Judge Ryan, which directed itself at trying to improve our system of appointing, particularly or of selecting justices for the Supreme Court in the state of Michigan.
Any frustrations or low points that you can share with us?
Oh yes, certainly low points. As I indicated earlier, it was difficult for me to be constantly on the losing end of decisions during those years when precedent was being swept away so generally, and to write so many dissents. I got pretty good at writing dissents, it seemed to me, for quite a period. There was also a period early in the 1990s when I was on the Court of Appeals, and I remember the caseload in that court at that time for a brief couple years was so heavy that it was really difficult to keep up with it and get the work done without growing numb and losing sensitivity to the plight of the people whose legal problems came before that court.
Marilyn, when I asked you to come on the show, we talked about the fact that there were certain key issues we wanted to discuss. And one of the first ones is, why is it important to plan for retirement?
Could you repeat that? Your voice got garbled there.
Why is it important to plan for retirement before retiring? That was one of the issues you wanted to discuss.
Right. Well, I found it very useful to plan ahead. And I had the luxury of knowing when I'd be leaving the court because of the state of the law, which required me to leave when my term expired after I'd reached age 70. And I found it very helpful to think it through ahead of time and not find myself confronted with the problems of suddenly being out of work, so to speak, without a plan. I'd strongly recommend that to anybody who's looking at retirement down the line. Start evaluating what matters and what will make you happy and what will make you fulfilled in years to come.
I agree. I think it's important to retire well. You've got to have a focus. You've got to have a passion. You've got to have something you want to and love doing, because otherwise people get bored, and often through boredom or through depression, that's when illnesses start to follow. I
agree.
How do you bring your skills and experience to post-retirement activities, which was another issue that you wanted to explore with us?
Well, in my case, I was fortunate in being able to run for and be elected to the board at Wayne. And that's been very fulfilling for me. Teaching at the law school has been enormously fulfilling. I've enjoyed the interplay with the students. They teach me a lot.
What do you teach at the law school? I
teach a seminar which I've created, which is entitled Access to Justice, which deals with that justice gap that I mentioned a little earlier. And I encourage the students through this seminar to be aware of the importance as they become practicing attorneys to doing pro bono work and even for considering public service work. I've also found it useful to volunteer for other board work. And so, for example, I'm on a church board and I'm on the board of Leader Dogs for the Blind in Rochester, Michigan, which I find also very interesting and very fulfilling.
Marilyn, what are you in having a bucket list?
Yeah, for me, I've always functioned best when I had goals and objectives. And I found that if I had a bucket list, I was happier generally. I could check things off as I accomplished them. Increasingly, as I age, matters on the bucket list involve my health and well-being. And also the matters that interest me that I'd never been able to get to when I was busy working full time.
How much time does being on the Board of Governors take? Is it very time consuming?
From time to time, it's overwhelming, and other times it gets quiet. Right now, during the pandemic, it's been an enormous challenge and time-consuming effort to help respond to the many changes that are required because of the changes in our lives that this epidemic has brought.
Why do those who are gracefully or graying, I use gracefully graying because of what I'm doing, but why do they score higher on tests of social communication and diplomacy?
I'm glad you pointed that out. I think we often worry as we age that we'll become less able to retain information, to quickly remember names or dates, become forgetful. The fact is that it's also true that people, as they age, frequently score higher on tests involving their own ability to handle stress, to negotiate difficult conflicts, generally, I think it's a question of simply bringing to bear the experience that one has as one grows older, that one has acquired after years of practical experience. Sometimes defeats or hard times leave us better able to negotiate difficulties and stresses than younger people are able to.
So it's a matter of having patience and better able to deal with conflicts, settling arguments, possibly better negotiating skills.
True. Yeah, right. That's what the statistics are telling us, and we do find many fine mediators and arbitrators and judges who are in the grain area of their lives.
That's interesting. As we're talking, I'm thinking about the fact that those of us who are gracefully graying and aging have a lot to offer to society, to, whether it's to a church, whether it's to a local charity or other groups. Yet it seems to me that other cultures seem to value the elderly more than we do here in the United States. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's true. Certainly, it was my experience when I lived abroad. I could witness that firsthand. I lived in France for a year and traveled in Western Europe quite a bit. That was one difference I saw between our culture and theirs. I'm hopeful that as our population grays, which it does in this country graying, that there'll be an increased appreciation for what older people have to offer to the well-being of society.
Well, in Michigan, over 50% of the population is 50 and over, and nationwide it's a very high percentage. You mentioned about controlling emotions. Why, as we age, are we better to do that? I think some people seem to be less patient. Tell us about that thought.
Well, you could well be right. I think being less patient might be true, but being able to control anger, for example, to not be overwhelmed with discouragement, is something that older people handle well. Because, for example, we've had experience with things going wrong and with people irritating us, and we tend to learn over time how best to handle that, so as not to make the situation worse, and so as to be able to reach one's objective profitably, I'd say.
You also mentioned we're better able to weather stress. What is the basis for that?
I think that when we've been down a road a number of times, we can look back at our past experience, which was stressful, and say, this isn't as bad as it might appear at first blush. I've been able to get through this kind of problem before. I know I can do it again. I think that that's one of the things that makes it easier for us to handle some stress.
It's interesting. You talk to people, and everyone has their own stress. Everyone has their own issues. Right. In many cases, when you hear about another person's problems, you say, mine aren't so bad, and I'd rather have my stress and my worries than someone else's. So right. I think there's truth to what you're saying. You also mentioned when we were talking about preparing this show, the importance of finding meaning in our lives. Let's discuss that with us for a moment.
Right. I've found it an advantage as I've aged to be able to settle on what I like to do with my time and what brings me satisfaction and pleasure. I know when I was younger, I would grope around more for figuring that out, and it's comforting to know without a lot of concern just what it is that I want to spend my time doing and what I'll get fulfillment from.
Well, What have you changed? And especially now that we're under this pandemic, has the bucket list changed at all due to that?
Definitely, right. And what's difficult about the bucket list these days is trying to figure out what the future is holding in terms of possibilities. I know trips that I've planned, I'm sure you've experienced this too. Trips that I planned have been canceled. A writers' conference I was looking forward to is not taking place. And in its place, I'm finding, though, that there's, and I'm sure you find this, there's a great deal available on the internet that we can turn to. That's, that carefully selected is very fulfilling.
You know, it's a different world. And now, you know, I interviewed Chief Justice McCormick on Friday, and we were talking about the fact that the legal system is going to march heavily into Zoom technology and using video conferencing for everything from scheduling, motions, and trials. So it's a lot of what's going on now. I think it's going to become a new normal. What are some other words of wisdom you would like to share with us? We have about a minute and a half before we have to sign off. And
Okay.
Really, it's important. I really appreciate your coming on.
Well, I appreciate being here. Well, I can only really speak for what works for me, I think, when it comes to giving advice, and tell you what the advice is that I give myself. And that is that I make it a goal to stay involved in work that I enjoy and that makes me feel that I'm adding value to parts of society, even if only in small ways, by using the expertise that I've developed over the years.
Got a lot of expertise. You have a lot of tools, and I know we're going through some trying times, and I know the Board of Governors at Wayne State University has been going through some trying times. But if anyone has the ability to have a firm hand on the tiller of the ship, so to speak, you're the right person for the moment.
That's very kind of you. I do appreciate it, Henry, and I've appreciated your contributions to the legal profession over these many decades that I've known you.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I want to thank you so much for being my guest on Gracefully Green. And I want to thank our viewers for watching Gracefully Green. This has been an important conversation. We share some of the ways to really gracefully gray and live life fully. Thank you again. Former Justice Kelly, current chair of the Board of Governors of Wayne State University. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.